Welcome back. Teamwork Arts in association with Consul General of India in Houston, Asia Society Texas Center, and Imprint welcomes you to this session of JLF Houston Virtual Festival. Winners take all. Anand Giridharadas in conversation with Kanishk Tharoor. Political philosopher Anand Giridharadas takes on the privileged classes in his scorching new book, the best-selling Winners Take All. It investigates the global elite's efforts to change the world, except in ways that threaten the social order and their position atop it. The searing critique of modern plutocrats who seek to do more good but never less harm is described as a call to action for elites and everyday citizens alike. A session that offers transformative perspectives to complex societal problems. In conversation with author and critic Kanishk Tharoor. Anand Giridharadas is a writer and author of most recently Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, and the newsletter The Dot Inc. His other books are The True American, Murder and Mercy in Texas, which is about a Muslim immigrant's campaign to spare from death row the white supremacist who tried to kill him, and India Calling, an intimate portrait of a nation's remaking. He's an editor-at-large for Time, an air political analyst for MSNBC, and a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. Kanishk Tharoor. Kanishk is a senior editor at Foreign Affairs. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Guardian, The Atlantic, The Nation, The New Yorker, Paris Review, and elsewhere, and has been nominated for a National Magazine Award. He is the presenter of the BBC radio series Museum of Lost Objects and the author of Swimmer Among the Stars, a collection of short fiction that was a Guardian Book of the Year and an NPR Book of the Year. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to send in your questions by typing in the question box on your screens. All our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Do follow our pages at JLF Lit Fest across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to be notified of the upcoming session. Stay tuned to the jlflitfest.org/Houston for the full schedule and information about our speakers. In these unusually difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF Houston without charging a registration fee. Please donate as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. You can donate to us on our website, jlflitfest.org/Houston. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Winners Take All. Kanishk, over to you.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you, Anand, for joining us today. And thank you all who are, opaque to us behind the Zoom screen. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to get to talk to Anand. We've, I think, met in the past, but I haven't really ever had a chance to talk to you about your work. Let me begin by, by saying that in the last decade or so in the United States, you've been hearing more and more and more about inequality. Maybe that might have begun with Occupy Wall Street, that sort of great protest that shook the country. But it's become more mainstream to the point that inequality is a common theme in the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, in the success of economists like Thomas Piketty and more recently Gabriel Zucman, and to the fact that places like the World Bank and the IMF are also now quite commonly talking about inequality. And your book sort of joins this conversation at this moment where, in a sense, that inequality has kind of gone mainstream. But instead of looking at political regulations and economic structures. So to say, your focus in the book is on philanthropists and a sort of their sort of social model of change. Why did you take that focus? And what does that the social model of change as proposed by the billionaire class have to say about inequality?
Well, it's a joy to be in conversation with you. And thank you to the JLF for figuring out a virtual version of how to have these literary conversations. It's a very good question you ask. I would say, thinking about also this as an event that is an Indian event and an American event, provides one way to answer that question, which is in all societies at all times in history, there is an up and a down. There's an upstairs and a downstairs. And depending on where you are and when you are, the nature of that upstairs and downstairs, who is upstairs, who is downstairs, how many, the proportion of people upstairs to downstairs, the nature of the door separating upstairs and downstairs, whether you have a steps and staircase or escalator or fire pole, all of those things are different, but there's always an upstairs and a downstairs. And there are many things in all, so you can talk about the Indian caste system, you can talk about race in America, you can talk about the kind of economic inequality issues that I focus on in this book. But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard systems. The law, gating your communities, formalizing things like caste or race into policy and practice so that people literally cannot climb. But a lot of those upstairs, downstairs hierarchies would not be possible without a further ingredient, which is culture, the conquest of culture, the conquest of common sense, the conquest of what most people believe. You know this from the Indian context. If you really, if 90% of people in India thought that traditional hierarchies in India were full of shit and made no sense, they would be much harder to maintain than if a lot of people in some deep way buy into them, at least somehow, buy into some of their propositions, buy into some of the idea of the naturalness of this order. And so you can look at that in India, you can look at that in feudal Britain, the Downton Abbey world. I chose to look at that upstairs, downstairs split in America in the neoliberal era of the last 40 years. And while other people have written great books about the hard power and the way in which that was achieved and prosecuted, the way in which money and politics was done, the way billionaires organized themselves to grab power, to build institutes and universities, so on and so forth, to confirm judges that did their bidding. Jane Mayer's written an extraordinary book called Dark Money about this. Kurt Anderson has a new book called Evil Geniuses about this. Nancy MacLean has a book called Democracy in Chains about this. That's an important and well-told story. I wanted to tell a different story that comes a little bit later in the 40 years, in which these very people who spent these years building a system that only works for the winners, building a system in which the fruits of progress are basketed almost entirely by those at the very top, realizing that at some point the game was going to be up. At some point people were going to start resenting them. At some point the Bernies and the Elizabeths would come along. At some point Occupy would come along. They understood, they read the tea leaves. They started doing a second thing, which is telling a story about not only the naturalness of this division, but also about the fact that they, on top, were the only people who could save us from it. And it was like adding an extra bolt on the door and reinforcing that door. Because what it did was to say, yes, we recognize that we have been the great winners of an age of inequity, or an age of cruelty. They stopped denying it, they started owning it. They stopped saying the Reagan era trickle-down stuff. They understand that there's a problem. But what the winners did, and my book is about philanthropy, but it's also about impact investing, and it's also about for-profit businesses that claim they're changing the world through their business and various other forms of elite do-gooding. Through this elite do-gooding, they have spun a story that you cannot change this social order, because if you do, you're going to hurt the very people who are most capable of saving you from it, which happens to be the people who cause these problems in the first place.
You call the sort of nexus of business and academia and think tanks and NGOs that are sort of engaged in this sort of way of screening wealth. You call it market world. I'm curious, to what extent is it, as you say, a continuation of the sort of do-good capitalism of Carnegie, of somebody like the Carnegies who you write about, an early, a century ago, industrial age capitalists who sort of pioneered philanthropy as we know it in the United States today. To what extent is it a continuation of that tradition? Or to what extent does it really represent something new and reflect the world we live in right now?
It's a great question. So there's a lot of continuity with that. When the Carnegie era, that was new, right? That really had not existed when that developed, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. And what was new about that about 100 years ago was that you had people making enough money that when they decided to give back and sort of invented this idea of philanthropy, which is different from charity, right? There's charity in every religious tradition, giving $1 away can be charity. Philanthropy, as it's used now as a term, was really these big fortunes by very big takers turned givers. And what distinguished it from the beginning 100 years ago was that from the moment they began to give, they were quasi-governmental in their level of giving. And that has only become truer. So that's certainly continuity. I mean, today, Bill Gates' spending on education or public health in America is not, it's higher in some cases and lower than other cases in a typical state budget for education, right? So you're really looking at significant firepower that began to be, that was qualitatively new. So I think this notion that Carnegie really developed in his famous Gospel of Wealth is another source of continuity, which is the best lived life, the best life you can live is, as a business person, is to make as much money as possible, cutting whatever corner you need to cut. And Carnegie really justifies this. Business is ruthless. It is hard to stay afloat. You got to let these people do what they got to do. And then in a second phase of life, in the time of grandchildren and reading glasses, you take that outsized fortune that you have and you give it back. Now, Carnegie actually had a radical view of this that very few philanthropists actually have today. Carnegie felt that the money you ended up with was not actually yours, that you were a custodian of these societal resources, and that your skill in business allowed you to kind of husband, but that it was actually belonged to the public. And the paternalistic element was you deserve, and you are brilliant, so you deserve to administer it and do what's best for the public. But he actually thought you have to give it all away in your lifetime, which is actually quite a radical view at that time. What has changed? So a lot of that is still very much the practice. A couple things have changed. One, a lot of the money in the world today, and this is true in India, it's true in the United States, is people making that kind of money much, much earlier in life, right? So there's a lot of 25, 30, 40-year-olds who are already at that phase. So this notion of the two-phase life goes away, right? These people have ongoing business activities, often ongoing predatory activities, and they want to start this thing. And so look at Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg, at this hour, is endangering the completion of the American election by platforming misinformation and hatred and COVID disinformation, electoral disinformation. One of the great, Facebook has established itself as the new Fox News in this cycle, way more powerful in many ways. At the same time, at this very moment, Mark Zuckerberg has been spending $300 or $400 million on election security, right? Which is a bit like the arsonist coming back to the scene of the fire and asking if there's anything he can do to help out, bring a bucket of water, happy to contribute. So that is new in the sense that there's these people who are 30, 40 years old who are still very much in the game, still very much causing social problems, and are simultaneously operating at this quasi-governmental scale to solve the problems they are still causing. I think another thing that's new and is captured in this phrase Philanthro-capitalism, that was, this book that came out, I think 2008, fall of 2008, right as the world was tanking. And the original subtitle was How the Rich Can Save the World. As you know, book subtitles are decided well in advance. When the book came out in September 2008, How the Rich Can Save the World
Great timing.
was not a fashionable subtitle, so they changed the subtitle. Unfortunately, they did not withdraw the book. But the book spoke in that moment to a view that I think is another part of the answer to your question, which is there is a view captured in that book that the entrepreneurial money in this time, and this is a narrative, by the way, I hear a lot in India also, that there's something about these modern globalized era, Tom Friedman era entrepreneurs that is so brilliant, so able to solve problems in ways that no one has been able to solve them in the past, that every problem, not just business problems, would be better left to them. Education, leave it to them. The development of the arts, leave it to them. Newspaper ownership, leave it to them. It's not just a claim in the Carnegie sense about you owe the society the return of these undue monies. It's not just the Adam Smith claim about leave people alone and then the butcher regarding, taking care of his own interest and the baker taking care of it, everybody will provide the most benefit for all. That's in a way a modest claim, which is just leave people alone and the market will work. This is a claim that business people and entrepreneurs at the top of their game have a special kind of mind and should actually be allowed to decide everything.
And, the premise behind those claims is also that government is fundamentally inept, incapable of delivering to citizens. And it's interesting now because in the United States, perhaps unlike India, you are getting more and more voices talking about the needs for things like wealth taxes, stronger government institutions, and especially taxation being is one of the major things that people are talking about more. But how do you convince people, and especially say Indians, for example, who sort of take for granted that part of the story of India's rise is in the last 30 years is government getting out of the way, and it's a bit of a cliche, but how do you convince people then that the flip side to what the philanthropists or what this market world class is proposing, that really what we need is stronger redistributive functions by government?
It's such a good question. And, what's very interesting is, and I love the two different country examples because they're both very relevant, but different stories. So in the American story, you're absolutely right that there has been this, part of the upstairs, downstairs narrative, one of the strands of that narrative is this notion that government is terrible. Government's evil, government's the problem. If there's a problem in your life, it's probably caused by the government. Bureaucrats are dangerous. And on the flip side of that, the valorization of entrepreneurs, right? Some guy who makes, an app that allows you to share photos on this thing and gets $1 billion valuation is a genius and a hero. But the people who make the food safe to eat for 350 million people is someone you never think about, never be on a magazine cover. So there has been this ideology, let's be clear, it is an ideology that government is useless. And if you look at a society like the United States, and we can get to India in a second because it's a different story, it is a preposterous story, right? Because think about it for 2 seconds, and let's actually use India as a foil. Look at the United States. What distinguishes India from the United States? You think there's smarter people in the United States that account for this wealth? I don't think so. You think there's, better run companies? I think Indian companies are at the top of their game. The top companies in India are as well run as the top companies in the United States. Is it, history? Yes. Obviously, there's very different histories there and a colonial history that unfolded differently in both places. But you know what's really, really different between the United States and India? The quality of public institutions, right? You know what's really, really, really different between the United States and India? The courts, right? For all the decay of Donald Trump, for all these right-wing judges they've stuffed in, for most people's purposes, for most business people's purposes, right? When you're talking about economic growth, the American court system is a safe, reliable, trustworthy system that you hopefully never need to use, but I can go into business with that person. I can form a company with this person. I can buy this supply for my factory and nothing terrible is going to happen, right? As you know, in India, it's a very good chance if something goes wrong with your business, you're going to have to resort to some other method besides the courts to enforce contracts. Well, that really is a pain. So I'm just picking one example of the courts. Now, if I remember correctly, the United States federal courts cost $80 billion a year, right? Sounds like a lot of money. It's a very, very small amount of money in the amount of the federal government's budget. $80 billion a year, right? That allows trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of money to be invested, spent, bought with safety, peace of mind, confidence. Which private sector investor has generated a better return on investment than we have gotten by investing $80 billion a year in the federal courts of the United States? I would be very curious who can offer a higher ROI than that, okay? Or Social Security, right? I think Social Security, if you removed it this year, several million people would older people would immediately fall into poverty now, immediately. It's the only thing keeping them out of poverty, right? I'm curious which private sector initiative has done more for old people or even would generate higher social and economic returns than Social Security, right? You look at, again, another comparison to the United States and India, food safety, right? How many people are harmed, get sickened or killed by food safety issues in India, right? In countries like the United States, thanks to wealth, but also thanks to very elaborate government systems that inspect food in restaurants and FDA and USDA and meat plants, whatever, that is an issue that has almost been removed from American life. When you and I go out to eat in the United States, it's something you do not have to think about. It's not, you can't eat this, can't eat that, what about the water, right? How much value, how much social and economic value does it generate in the United States to have a food safety system that basically makes that something that you almost never have to think about or worry about, right? So I loathe this notion that the private sector is somehow productive and generative and the institutions of government are inefficient, because they actually provide. I mean, I just took a drive this morning on a highway that I'm sure has occasioned more private value creation than any of the people driving on it have occasioned personally. So we got to push back against that notion. Now, the India aspect of your question is very interesting because the history there is different, and you did have this socialist experiment in the first decades after independence that was, viewed by many people as stifling, was stifling to many people. It's part of the reason my family ended up moving to the United States. So I'm not in any illusions about that. But I also think this story of India, which I covered as a journalist in the 2000s, is often used and abused by outsiders as a very oversimplified narrative of India in 1991 opened the markets. That's not the only thing India did around that time, right? Like, something a lot of people, outsiders, certainly don't know is that was almost exactly the same time that India initiated the reservations and set-asides for, I think, 49% of people in government jobs, academia, etc. That's by far the largest affirmative action, reparative social justice program possibly in the history of the world, right? 49% of government jobs and university seats and other things. So I don't know, is what happened in India afterwards, to what extent is it unshackling the market versus to what extent was it giving tens of millions of historically marginalized people opportunities they wouldn't have had before? I mean, I don't know that you can start picking apart. I think it was the interaction of those things. There certainly were government structures in India that were stifling to people, stifling to competition, stifling the ability to create things. But you know what? There are a lot of other things in India that were stifling that weren't government controls. And I wrote about this in my India book. I mean, I have a sentence that a lot of Indian people don't like family is the beginning of the Indian tragedy. It's not a popular sentence, but traditional norms around family in India were as stifling of people following their dreams as, socialist government controls. Misogyny in India arguably destroyed way more potential and dream creation than socialist government controls. The caste system and its residue arguably destroyed way more potential and dream creation than socialist government controls. So what India has been doing in the last few decades is not a single thing. It's been doing many good things at the same time. And I think it is the interaction of a whole bunch of women being able to play roles in society that their mothers and grandmothers couldn't. A whole bunch of people from marginalized backgrounds being given academic and job opportunities they wouldn't have had before, and the market and globalization, and you know, government spending on rural employment guarantee and things like that. It's a very mixed story that actually, to me, advocates for a kind of humble notion of markets and government working together to make people's lives better, rather than the kind of dogmatic love markets or love government and hate the other that so often prevails.
Right. Let's not incur the wrath of too many aunties and uncles by telling them that that their family is not a good idea. But you know, just to we are actually already getting cues about time. I wanted to note that, you know, in the months since the pandemic began, U.S. billionaires have added close to $1 trillion to their wealth. How do you see the pandemic feeding into the? I mean, your book was published 2 years ago, but how do you see the pandemic feeding into the dynamics that you sort of followed and explored in the book? It's
so interesting. I mean, you're right about those numbers, and one number that makes it maybe easier to access for people. So Jeff Bezos employs 876,000 people around the world. Let's say he were to just listen to our conversation today and feel moved. You know, you are such a good interviewer that maybe he just feels moved by the spirit, and he decided to give $105,000 as a bonus to every employee of Amazon for their hard work in helping to supply America and other countries in this time. If he gave those $105,000 to 876,000 people, he would lose a considerable amount of wealth, but he would still be exactly as rich as he was in March. He would only be giving away the wealth he made since March. And that's just one person. So that's a kind of measure of what we're talking about. And, you know, it's the different reasons that the billionaire class got wealthy in the pandemic. Some of it is like Amazon. You know, there were certain companies that were very well positioned when people couldn't go out or couldn't do things. They order products to their house. That was certainly one thing. You know, certain businesses, obviously like air travel, suffered, while things like, you know, grocery stores have gone up. So there was that. But it wasn't just that. It was also that when bailouts happened in the United States, those with very fancy lobbyists were able to make sure that the bailouts bailed companies out before they bailed individuals out. That Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, giant restaurant chain, got a small business bailout because each of its individual restaurants is classified as a small business, even though it has so many. Whereas the Twisted Egg Roll, a small business in Chicago with one location that I wrote about, did not get a bailout, even though the woman applied on the first day, filled out all the paperwork, did everything she needed to, checked with her bank twice, said, "Ma'am, sorry, the bailout has run out." On the first day? First day, but Ruth's Chris Steakhouse got the bailout instead. And so the pandemic has not only widened the gap in a quantitative sense, it has deepened the power gap that is behind the economic gap. It has shown the ways in which those at the very top can always manage to bend any twist in the road of history to their advantage, no matter what it is. Climate can be made to work for them. Climate change, you know, a pandemic can be made to work for them. A labor crisis can be made to work for them. Low employment can be made to work for them. High employment can be made to work for them. Millions of people foreclosed on in the 2008 crisis, another opportunity for them. No matter what happens, when you are that powerful with that much impunity and that much of a chokehold on the political system, good things and the bad things are all good things for you. But what the pandemic has also done, and what I hope these many, many people who have died have not died in vain. because I think in their deaths, in their suffering, and in the suffering of many larger numbers of people, economically and otherwise, there has also been a tremendous amount of revelation about our system. And this has been in the United States. This summer was a summer of, a Black Lives Matter uprising, this health crisis, this economic crisis caused by the health crisis, but also much longer in origin, the democratic crisis embodied by Donald Trump now in its last legs, and the climate crisis hovering over. And I think those 5 crises bearing down on us all at the same time with this kind of dramatic, acute phase has done us the favor of seeing very clearly, if we hadn't before, that we have not been living right. It's not just that the system's broken or that there's inequality. Like, we haven't been living right. In a whole bunch of dimensions, we have not been living right. And when that becomes clear in certain moments in history, clearer than before, sometimes the public has the wisdom and the stomach to change how we all live.
You note in the book that people who voted in the 2016 presidential election here in the US, that people who voted for Trump and against Trump both were in search of some kind of transformational change. Now it seems, notwithstanding the soft coup currently underway, it seems pretty clear that Biden is going to be president, that he's won the election by a much more comfortable margin in the Electoral College, votes-wise, than Trump did, that he's won the popular vote by immense numbers. There is this sort of, one of the interpretations of this vote, especially when it focuses on things like how Biden won back or has won over the suburban vote, the white suburban vote, the middle-class suburban vote, is that, it's not so much transformational change, but that people are in search of a kind of restoration. Do you buy that interpretation? And let's just say that is the case. Would that be, for you, a cause for concern?
I think it's a good question in that I think it's hard to parse what a mandate is for always and what people voted for. Because when you actually talk to voters, people's motivations are much more complex and contradictory and pointing in all kinds of directions than those of us who write about these things frame them as. There's no question that Joe Biden did not run on a far left progressive platform. On the other hand, as the campaign advanced, he became one of the only American candidates in memory to tack to the left, tack towards his base of his party rather than the center in the general election. He and his campaign began to make noises about recognizing that they needed to do a bigger, more ambitious presidency than they had initially run on. An FDR-sized presidency was language they started putting out. So I'm going to take him at his word that by the time people were voting in October and November, what he had said publicly was different from the stance he'd taken in the primary, and really was, it's not Bernie, but let's say he got closer to an Elizabeth Warren view of the world than he was a year earlier. And so I'm going to take him at his word. I'm going to recognize him for who he is. I don't think he's going to be Bernie, and I don't expect him to be Bernie. But I think I'm going to hold him to his own notion of an FDR-sized presidency. And in a way, it doesn't matter whether that's going to go down easy with voters or not. At some point, you got to lead. You got to win, and then you got to lead. And people need that kind of change, whether or not they realize they need that kind of change. I don't think the average voter, in FDR's time, had a particular view on which way of doing banking policy would have been best for their interests. At some point, these are questions that smart people need to think about and do what's right for the country. I think it is a fantasy to think that you can continue to have employer-based healthcare in the United States of America after watching this pandemic. It's preposterous. 22 million people lost their job. What world are you in if you think that tying healthcare to employment is the best way to do it? I mean, I'm 39 years old. I have never had employer-provided health insurance in a country where that's the system, right? I went to get had an ear infection the other day, very minor ear infection. Do not worry. And I went to get eardrops, and they were $200 for antibiotic eardrops because my deductible is very high because I have some crappy, So I think there's and I'm lucky that I can afford it. But for a lot of Americans, that would be like the financial calamity of the year. And so the system we have is barbaric in this country. I think for a lot of people listening in India, I don't think you'd realize how many people are living in various forms of squalor in the richest country on earth. And so there is a moment right now where Joe Biden is going to have an opportunity to do real change. And if I will probably be right here back with you in a few months being cynical about him, but we're still on the first date. There's no reason to be cynical about him right now because he hasn't done anything yet. And I think this is the moment when we actually need to say, this guy has an opportunity to deliver real change. He has a crisis that actually justifies it. And if there's one thing I will say about him, even though he was not my cup of tea in the primary, it is that he has a political skill at making some of these things sound safe and folksy and common sense to middle-class Americans in a way that a lot of people in American politics don't. And there's a way in which, his popular touch with that, his acute understanding of where the median voter is psychologically, which is really his great skill, could be used if he chooses to be a president of any significance to actually do some fundamental things on climate and health and other things that actually maybe a more progressive president would struggle to get done.
Thanks, Anand. We've reached the sort of listener question portion of the session. And I'm going to begin with a question from Becca Albert, who asks, what would the ideal system in America look like to you, including the role of corporations? That's sort of big picture question, I guess. Is this idea of better capitalism we even have a valid goal to you?
Well, I think what it would look like would be something that obtains more or less in most of the other rich countries. I mean, part of what I'm calling for is the end of an American economic exceptionalism. And, it's one thing to say like we should go to Mars, because that feels hard. That feels like a hard problem. You haven't really done it before. No one's done it. You're like, how are we going to get to Mars? This is not like that. There's like 15 countries that have solved many of the problems I'm talking about in ways that are fully documented and available for study, right? So this is like being the 16th country to go to Mars. At some point, it's not that hard to be the 16th country that goes to Mars, right? So like, let's go to Mars. And what that looks like, if you look at this variation within those countries, right? Britain is on one end of things, Germany's on another, the Nordic countries are a whole other place. You got the Nordic countries with oil, that's an easier place to be redistributed from. You have a lot of variation. Variation's good, right? You can say, ooh, they did that. Britain's still pretty free market, but they did health. That's one just major difference from the US. What kind of outcomes did they get? How much did it cost them? Germany does, public education all the way through college, free. What are the outcomes they got? What does it cost? How does that work? You can study things. Not a lot of Americans like to be told this, but actually you can look at the experiences of other countries to learn about how to do things. And what I think that system would look like is like everything that exists now would still exist. Just the proportions would be different and the power relationships would be different. And all these people trying to say, business would be abolished or we'd become like Venezuela under Maduro. Like it's all preposterous. It's all scaremongering. You look at Germany, you look at Norway, they have a business sector, they have capitalists, they have entrepreneurs, they have government, they have civil society, they have academia, they have journalists, they're all the same people we do, right? Just different organs in the body. What is different from us is they don't have one organ, which is the business sector, that has essentially decided that its only way of existing is to eat all the other organs of the body, right? And I'm sometimes asked, this is more than you bargained for, I'm sometimes asked this about my first book about India, had certain elements of it that were celebratory of what Kanishk and I were talking about before in terms of the market, the role of the market in India and small towns where people had new possibilities and women had new possibilities than they had before. I welcomed that when I saw it. Why? Because in that case, what I saw was not business eating all the other organs. it was that business and markets were actually a relatively small force in some of those communities and contexts, eating into other structures that were way more predatory, right? The traditional ideas about what a woman could be in small town India were a much bigger, more predatory force, and a bank coming to town and saying, I'll pay you 10,000 rupees a month, and a dad in that small town saying, well, I don't really believe in women working, but 10,000 rupees a month, I kind of believe in it now. That market in that context did a good thing, changed people's social mores, empowered women. So these different organs in the body politic, they're always going to be there, right? North Korea has a black market, right? There's capitalism in North Korea, whether they acknowledge it or not. Cuba's got a black market. Like, there's buying and selling happening everywhere. There's government happening everywhere, right? The question is, what is the balance among all these things? And in America, in the last 40 years, the balance has been hugely off because of a business sector that essentially believes it can't coexist with any of the other organs of our body.
I wanted to ask you, actually, you have been a pretty outspoken supporter of Black Lives Matter and the sort of movement, the swelling of movements and protests in favor of racial justice and a reckoning with America's racial record. When companies like Uber and other big corporations sort of took on the mantle of Black Lives Matter, how did you respond to that? And what did it make you think about?
Near my house, there's a huge, outside this arena, there's a huge ad, or at least was over the summer, Uber billboards saying, we support Black Lives Matter or whatever. I mean, here's the issue. A lot of these companies put on what I would call corporate blackface to make all the right noises around Black Lives Matter, but they don't pay Black people more. Uber does not reclassify Black drivers or any other drivers as employees, and they fight when the government in California and elsewhere has tried to make them actually give them employee benefits. These companies that put out Black squares on Instagram for Black Lives Matter have not, as far as I know, any of them stopped the tax avoidance and double Dutch with an Irish sandwich tax avoidance, or Cayman Islands, this or that. I mean, avoiding taxes so that the federal government has way less money hurts the marginalized people most, because those are the first programs that get cut when there isn't enough money. I haven't seen any changes in that. So what would be much more helpful than companies tweeting Black Lives Matter, hashtags, would be to actually change their practices around the way they employ Black people and all people, the way they avoid or pay taxes, the way they frankly lobby for bottle service public policies in Washington that benefit them and hurt everybody else in the club. Changing the way they actually operate in the system would be the best way of declaring that Black Lives Matter.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions at the most, but Paresh asks, what view do you take on celebrities as policy issue advocates or champions of causes? For example, Bono and the One campaign to end extreme poverty, or Matt Damon and water. What do you think of those kinds of initiatives by celebrities? Yeah,
so I would say to separate two things. One is the use of celebrity as advocacy, and the second is what they're advocating. Unlike some people, I have zero problem with the former, the use of celebrity advocate. I mean, you have to play the game of your society, whatever that game is. And if it's the right things we're talking about doing, I'm happy to get anybody who can break through the noise, who can cut through the internet, who can get people to pay attention to something, can help an idea. I mean, look, I've been yelling ideas the way you have for some years now. And, I'm still yelling them because my reach is quite limited. So when, a Beyonce or a Jim Carrey or anyone else gets involved in amplifying good ideas, fantastic. The issue is, what are the types of causes they tend to gravitate to? And in general, they tend to gravitate partly because of their own wealth, obviously, but also I think partly because of what's been thought to be the dominant and right way to go. They've done a lot of market world type things, right? So donate to this, donate to that. what starts to get interesting, and to be honest, I've had some conversations with some of these folks. I had a very interesting 3-hour conversation with Jay-Z about this. That he was rethinking his, I never told anybody about this, but he was rethinking his attitude, which is very much steeped in this kind of market world thinking. And we had a 3-hour conversation together and talked about why systemic change is more important. And he actually read the book and like had some interesting reactions to it. So a lot of them are on this journey. And when that same celebrity voice is used to, for example, advocate for a wealth tax, that's really good. When that kind of celebrity voice is used to advocate for, you know, net neutrality or breaking up monopolies, that's the kind of stuff where celebrity is actually very helpful. Monopoly is an unsexy issue. So if you are a sexy celebrity, you can donate some of your sexiness, your surplus sexiness, to the issue of antitrust and monopoly to, you know, help make that sexier. And it actually won't cost you any of your sexiness. Sexiness is just, you know, it just adds up. And that's a kind of use that's great. And I think we're going to actually see more and more, if my sense of this is right, I think we're actually seeing more and more celebrities advocating for systemic and political change, as opposed to the kinds of, you know, cute fundraising causes that they often gravitated to in the past.
Anand, I think I could listen to you for twice as long, for many times longer than this, but unfortunately our time has run up. So I'm going to hand it over to Suraj, I guess. But thank you so much. It's so wonderful listening to you and to talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you for your brilliant questions. Those are like the best questions I've ever gotten.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Kanishk, for this really fascinating conversation. We just wish we could have received you in person and roll the red carpet for you. We're hoping next year. But thank you so much for being with us today and being part of the virtual edition of JLF Houston. And thank you all for watching and being a wonderful audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our fabulous speakers that are available through Brazos Bookstore and Full Circle. Once again, we would like to thank all our advisors, donors, and partners for generously supporting us. Our special thanks to Durga and Sushila Agarwal, Hari and Anjali Agarwal, Arshad and Shazma Martin, Ann Chow, Bela Jain, Jagdeep Aluwalia, Dr. Shaila and Sumant Patel, and India House in Houston. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in for our next session, Bollywood, In Search of the Feminine Gaze. Richa Chadda in conversation with Supriya Dravid at 11:15 a.m. Central Standard Time, 9:15 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and 10:45 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you once again. And now we present a reading by Pavitra Srikumar from the Jaipur Writer Shorts series. Enjoy.
Ants crawling on top of perfume, bottles full and filling, my stomach growling, screeching, vomiting. I am not well most of the days, but I try. To reach, to hold, to walk, to run away from him and toward him, like he is the house I was brought to, and this is the house I was never brought into. It was through windows and doors, windows and doors. Repeat them long enough and their meanings exchange. Glances and smiles, arms and laughs, like I am still at the edges, perimeters, with postures of places. I am not allowed more than lines. I am not allowed lines of light that bounce and curve, enough light for enough corners. I tackle them, they tackle each other, and I am spinning within. My mother told me, when you want to get involved, stand by a window. When you do not want to get involved, stand by a door. And I am stuck in the crevices between mother and child, child and mother. I sit down. Let the ages form cracks on window sills, doorknobs, wire mesh, keyholes. I sit down by doors and windows, windows and doors. I am sure that there are viewpoints that will let me be.
Hare Jaipur Literature Festival a living library, or perhaps even a library of life. Do join us as we share the excitement of ideas and of debate and dialogue, of the adventures of science, of the joys of poetry and music, the consolations of philosophy, the sense of literature and of life.
So much about the festival in India, the scale of it, the energy of it, and I just love the fact that there is this effort to bring it to other cities in the world.
It's a variety of topics. It's meaningful. I'm just excited. I'm feeling like I've learned a lot to think about, and I appreciate JLF coming here.
Going forward, it would be a very good thing to do for the community to have this event on an annual basis.
I think that when you hear so many different voices and perspectives about the South Asian diaspora and many other issues, you learn that there's a lot of history that you're not taught every day, and I think that that's important to bring in today's world.
I was actually really surprised by the camaraderie I experienced here and the way that people at JLF, both attendees and other panelists, seem to really connect profoundly to literature and care about it.
In 2020, our live version of JLF has been laid to waste because of COVID-19. However, nothing's going to stop us from coming in the way of bringing our writers and speakers to you in Boulder, Colorado, Houston, New York, and Toronto, Canada.
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers, and literary agents. Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia, and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature, and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars, be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Ion India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India circuit is an endeavor by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities, featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross, and Dave Weckel, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra Kabira Festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra Kabira brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine. Sacred celebrates the spiritual through music and its ability to heal. International artists collaborate with world music exponents from India amongst the most incredible desert settings on the banks of the Pushkar Lake. Heritage walks, meditation, talks and workshops are part of this weekend experience. Teamwork Arts so promotes and recognizes the best of Indian theatre through the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards. The Meta Week in Delhi is an enthralling showcase of the 10 best nominated plays shortlisted from numerous entries received from across the country and across languages. The Meta Lifetime Achievement Award has been presented to leading lights of India's theatre industry. For the young and the young at heart, the Ishara International Puppet Theatre Festival brings local and international performances to audiences across several Indian cities. While the Multi-City Kahani Festival features interactive storytelling sessions and workshops championing the power of imagination. Bollywood Love Story, a musical. Our international touring productions such as Bollywood Extravaganza and Flamenco India have sold out shows across Europe, Egypt, Russia and Spain. Expressions International Contemporary Dance Festival showcases Indian and international productions, bringing together several dance genres for Indian audiences. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit www.teamworkarts.com